Secure Synopsis, 21st May 2021, General Studies 2. Effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests and Indian diaspora. India is trying to balance between its old ties with Palestine and growing relations with Israel. Elaborate with examples. So, this question is about Israel and Palestine. Let's have a look at the answer to this question. At the Open UN Security Council session on the Gaza conflict, India, a non permanent member, attempted a delicate balancing act by reaffirming its traditional support for the Palestine cause without abandoning its new Israel friend. T.S. Tirumurthy, India's permanent representative at the UN, reiterated India's strong support for just Palestinian cause and its unwavering commitment to the two-state solution. India was careful not to upset Israel's sensitivities. Background to recent conflict: Israel has used disproportionate force against Hamas, which is fighting from Gaza. The action of Hamas also reflects the growing dissatisfaction with Mohammed Abbas, the moderate Palestinian leader based in Ramallah in the West Bank. Abbas has failed to conduct elections in the past 15 years. This has alienated a part of the Palestinian people and hardliners. This has also weakened the cause for a unified Palestine cause. 20% of Israel's population consists of Arab Muslims. The attack on Al Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest shrine of Muslims, has also alienated them, and they are sympathizing with the Palestinian cause. Together with political instability in Israel, this may lead to a civil war in Israel. The attack on the mosque has also given Islamic militants an opportunity to call for attacks across other parts of the world. India's stand on Israel Palestine issue, a balancing act. India has consistently voted in favor of those resolutions that promote the two state solution with a Palestinian claim to East Jerusalem. India has voted in a non partisan manner on UN resolutions with respect to Israel and Palestine. For instance, at the UN's ECOSOC in June 2019, which ended the consultative status for a Palestinian NGO that Israel claimed had terror links, India voted in favor of Israel. Whereas India has remained steadfast in its support for Palestinian rights and has consistently voted in favor of Palestine at the United Nations on 15 key resolutions. India again reaffirmed its call for a two state solution to the Israeli Palestinian conflict and asked both its sides to resolve all issues through direct negotiations. India's position on Palestine is independent and consistent. It is shared by our views and interests and not determined by any other country. This was proven when India did not support unilateral USA move to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel. India believes that status quo must be maintained until a permanent solution is reached. Looking at the ground situation, the resolution of the Israel Palestine conflict is still elusive. The only way forward is peace talks between the two countries as suggested by India and further negotiations on the two state solution proposed by the United Nations. Next topic: government policies and intervention for development in various sectors and issues arising out of their design and implementation. Explain the possible implications for the states of the interpretation of the 102nd Amendment by the Supreme Court in the Maratha reservation case. Let's have a look at the answer to this question. On May 5th, the Supreme Court of India declared as unconstitutional a Maharashtra law which provided for reservation to the Maratha community in education and public employment in the state. Four judges of the five-judge bench wrote separate opinions from which three primary findings emanated. Let's have a look at the body of this answer. Judgment and its contours. By a 3:2 majority, it ruled that after the passage of the 102nd Constitution Amendment Act in 2018, the states do not have any power to identify socially and educationally backward classes. One of the grounds was that the act creating the Maratha quota through a new category called SCBC was unconstitutional because after the introduction of the 102 Amendment, the state legislature had no power to identify any new backward class. Possible implications for the states due to Supreme Court judgment. Until now, the central government and each of the state governments produced a separate list declaring communities as socially and educationally backward. This division in power, which gave states autonomy to classify groups as backward, stood in contrast to the list of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In the case of those lists, right from the Constitution's inception, the power to prepare them vested solely with the Union government. The Supreme Court has now held that this distinction no longer holds good. If the majority's interpretation of the 102nd Amendment is correct, then the changes together disposes states from exercising a time honored authority. Divesting the states of a power, this critical, to classify groups as backward, entitling many communities to protection under Articles 15 Clause 4 and 16 Clause 4, can be seen as anything but offensive to the essence of federalism. The changes, as interpreted by the court, are by no means superficial. They directly impede the ability of states to secure a just social order. Conclusion: the Union government has already filed a petition to review the judgment insofar as it limits the power of state governments. Should the country refuse the plea, it is imperative that Parliament amends the Constitution and grants to states an express power to determine backwardness. Any other result will offend the delicate balance at the heart of Indian federalism. Let's move on to the next topic. Important aspects of governance, transparency, and accountability, e governance applications, models, successes, limitations, and potential, citizens' charters, transparency and accountability, and institutional and other measures. COVID 19 demands a new model of citizen focused governance. Do you agree? Comment. There is an urgent need to ensure citizen focused governance in the 21st century, where problems facing humanity are grave and unprecedented. The current century is likely to hurl even more menacing challenges from super cyclones to mutating viruses. Smart governance is the need of the hour. Citizen focused governance in times of pandemic is definitely the need of the hour because expert decision making is needed. An autonomous, fully empowered task force of top doctors, epidemiologists, scientists, even logistical experts to lead India on tracking the virus, genome sequencing, transport of oxygen, and vaccine procurement was needed. Decentralization and facilitation. The center not only needs to resist centralization of power, but also needs to facilitate the states. Decentralization does not mean leaving states to fend for themselves, as has happened with confusing vaccine policies. Cooperative federalism, center and states must urgently bridge the trust deficit. It is a matter of life and death. Prevent tug of war as seen in Delhi and West Bengal. Constant communication. In India, when semi literate populations can fall prey to fear, superstition, and irrational panic, there is a need for a fact based communication drive to inform the public and prevent panic. Fixing accountability, less bureaucratic cholesterol, and red tape means a better targeted, focused, and efficient system in which responsibility and accountability can be fixed. Thus, small government leadership to domain experts, decentralization, shunning over politicization, and a communication drive could become building blocks of smart government. What is the need of the hour? Cash transfers to the millions of the laboring poor will shield them from slipping deeper into hunger and joblessness and also spur growth because all of this would be spent for simple domestically produced goods. Therefore, the multiplier effects of this public expenditure would have been much higher than if spent on infrastructure projects. Free rations and meals, as mandated by the Supreme Court, though beneficial, have very little expansionary effect in the economy since the bulk of the commodities required come from decumulation of existing stocks of food grains. Thus, both the need to provide relief and imperative to revive the economy demand that a monthly cash transfer of about 7,000 per family, the rough equivalent of minimum wages, be made to people over and above the provision of free meals and rations. What the state needs to do urgently is to take a range of measures that prioritize the right to life, which also remains the surest way of initiating assured and equitable economic recovery today. Among them are enabling expanded production and central procurement of COVID 19 vaccines and distribution to states for free immunization to all. Universal access to free food grains of 5 kg per month to all those who require it for the next 6 months. Cash transfers of rupees 7,000 per household for at least 3 months to those without regular formal employment. Increased resources to the integrated child development services to enable revival and expansion of their programs, making the Manregas purely demand driven, with no ceiling on the number of days or the number of beneficiaries per household, and covering urban India with a parallel scheme that would also cater to the educated unemployed. Let's conclude. A smart government is humble and lean, works with evidence based data, is focused on citizens' lives and livelihoods, and works in partnership with citizens at every level with a bottom up rather than top down approach. Let's move on to the next topic: bilateral, regional, and global groupings and agreements involving India or affecting India's interests. Although Africa has been aggressively engaged with China, it wants India to act as a balancer and net security provider. Discuss. India's modern ties to Africa goes back to decades. From Indian trade with and immigration to Africa, from the British colonial years to India's anti-colonial national movement and its subsequent pioneering of the non-alignment movement, India established many links to African nations. In recent times, China has overpowered India in terms of economic engagement. Yet, India can leverage its soft power to improve footprint on Africa and counter aggressive Chinese in our neighboring continent. Background: although India has immense social capital among African nations, it has not matched this in material ties, and, and China's economic and investment presence in Africa has been outstripping India's for many years. Not only does China's economic footprint in Africa dwarf that of India, with over 10,000 Chinese firms operating on the continent, China becoming Africa's largest trading partner, but with the Belt and Road Initiative projects, China is offering more than simply large infrastructure projects and investments. China is essentially trying to offer an alternative authoritarian model of development to African countries. Its message is that no longer is the liberal international path the only road for African countries to take and prosper. Because of the social capital India has in Africa, acquired through the historical, political, economic, and people to people ties mentioned here, its presence is welcomed by African countries in a way that China is not. There is not a whiff, for example, of the accusation of neo imperialism aimed at Chinese. Companies such as Tata Motors in South Africa, Bharti Airtel, one of the largest telecom operators on the continent, and Aditya Birla Group are seen as beneficial for Africa. India Africa ties in recent times. India Africa trade reached $62 billion dollars in 2018 compared to $39 billion dollars during 2009 2010. After South Asia, Africa is the second largest recipient of Indian overseas assistance with lines of credit worth nearly $10 billion, dollars, 42% of the total, spread over 100 projects in 41 countries. Ties were boosted at the India Africa Forum Summit in 2015. 40% of all training and capacity building slots under the ITEC program have traditionally been reserved for Africa. Approximately 6,000 Indian soldiers are deployed in UN peacekeeping missions in 5 conflict zones in Africa. Bilateral cooperation includes solar energy development, information technology, cybersecurity, maritime security, disaster relief, counterterrorism, and military training. India has also launched several initiatives to develop closer relations, including the first ever India Africa Defence Ministers Conclave in Feb 2020 on the margins of the Defence Expo 2020. India provides about 50,000 scholarships to African students each year. The huge Indian diaspora is a major asset. Africa wants India to act as a balancer vis-a-vis China. Soft power: India was ranked higher than China in a survey with respect to trust and development initiatives in Africa. India is a development partner unlike China. China's engagement of Africa, as elsewhere, is huge but increasingly regarded as predatory and exploitative. Not just transactional, India is also expanding its development assistance to African countries beyond its traditional relationships within the Commonwealth in an effort to secure access to natural resources as well as serve its broader strategic aims. Developmental assistance. Currently, India's forte in the continent has been developmental initiatives such as Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation, Team 9, Pan Africa e Network, among others, are aimed at building institutional and human capacity as well as enabling skills and knowledge transfer. Humanitarian assistance. As recently as in 2019, India was the first responder to the Cyclone Idai crisis in Mozambique. This has immense potential in the backdrop of China's string of pearls in the Indian Ocean region. Pandemic cooperation: the Ministry of External Affairs has already extended the ITEC course on COVID 19 pandemic prevention and management guidelines for healthcare professionals to healthcare workers in Africa. Vaccine diplomacy: India sent crores of vaccines to poor African nations as aid under its Vaccine Maitri initiative. India must tie up with other nations such as Japan and fast forward joint projects like Asia Africa Growth Corridor. Even a Quad Plus idea was mooted where Africa can play a huge role, especially Eastern African nations. Africa's trust and faith in India can ensure India's role as a regional net security provider in the region, which may propel India as a world leader. General Studies 3: Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development, and employment. What is retrospective taxation? What has been the trend in India with respect to retrospective amendments of taxations? And let's explain this in this answer. The issue is in context of Kane Energy dispute. India's refusal to settle with Kane Energy after the recent arbitration award has opened up a prospect of a private company having to legally seize sovereign property globally, a course of action some of shareholders are starting to recommend. The cause of the problem is retrospective taxation, which India brought in 2012 via its budget. Kane Energy is suing Air India in New York to seize its assets to enforce $1.2 billion arbitration award it won against the Indian government in a retrospective tax dispute. What is retrospective taxation? As the name suggests, retrospective taxation allows a country to pass a rule on taxing certain products, items, or services and deals and charge companies from a time behind the day on which this law was passed. Countries use this route to correct any anomalies in their taxation policies that have in the past allowed companies to take advantage of such loopholes. While governments often use a retrospective amendment to taxation laws to clarify existing laws, it ends up hurting companies that had knowingly or unknowingly interpreted the tax rules differently. Amendments in respect of retrospective taxation. Till date, one of the major and most controversial retrospective amendment carried out was bringing indirect transfer under tax bracket by Finance Act 2012. Supreme Court in the case of Vodafone held that Section 9 does not authorize tax authorities to tax capital gains derived from the indirect transfer of shares of Indian company, while the main transaction was between two foreign companies to acquire a foreign company which had majority shares in Indian company. It may be noted that quantum of transaction and tax foregone by tax department due to the Supreme Court ruling was huge. Therefore, Department Government of India amended Section 9 of the Income Tax Act 1961 wired in Finance Act 2012 and provided that shares or interest in any foreign company or entity shall be deemed to be situated in India if such shares or interest derives its substantial value from assets located in India. Any capital gain from transfer of such shares or interest in foreign company deriving its substantial value from assets located in India was brought under a tax levy. Government did not stop at this amendment of new levy but made it effective retrospective from 1962. This would mean Vodafone case where entire transactions were already carried out and ruling was also pronounced by the Supreme Court could be brought to tax with its retrospective amendment. Let's have a look at the issues with retrospective taxation. Bharata Sarathi Shom panel had suggested that retrospective amendment of tax laws should occur in exceptional or rarest of rare cases and particular objectives and apply to matters that are genuinely clarifactory in nature. Such taxation policy instability leading to reduced investments. It deteriorates the confidence of business investors in India, thereby reducing the capital inflows into the country. Not only time, but huge number of resources are spent on costly litigations and arbitrations abroad. It does not bode well for investor sentiments and act as a disincentive for prospective investors. When India promised no longer tax terror, such policies go against the very fabric of stated objectives. Possibility of seizing sovereign property can lead to big humiliation for India. An investment friendly business environment would increase economic activity and help raise more revenue over time for the government. It is to be hoped that tax officials desire to deny their defeat and to try and hang on to legally untenable revenue fines and unsympathetic hearing from politicians in the finance ministry. India needs to craft meaningful and clear dispute resolution mechanisms in cross border transactions to prevent the disputes from going to international courts and save the cost and time expenditure. Improving the arbitration ecosystem will have a positive impact on the ease of doing business. Let's move on to the next topic. Indian economy, same thing. Let's have a look at the question. Private cryptocurrencies are best treated as risky investment assets rather than actual currencies in the age of renewed inflation fears. Analyze. The age of cryptocurrencies dawned in 2008. In October that year, Satoshi Nakamoto wrote his famous proposal for a new form of peer to peer payments that would bypass the traditional financial system. Bitcoin. The use of blockchain technology for a payment system is without doubt one of the most exciting new developments in finance. Cryptocurrencies are better suited to be investment assets, though they are susceptible to roller coaster rides, since there is no way the supply can adjust to swings in demand. We have seen a lot of this in recent months. The antics of Dogecoin are only the starkest example. Private cryptocurrencies should ideally be treated as risky investment assets rather than currencies, even as the central banks begin work on using blockchain to issue a new form of sovereign money. Many cryptocurrencies enthusiasts see them as protection against the high inflation that central banks tend to unleash on the world. Private cryptocurrency risky investment assets. The idea of a private frictionless payment system with 2.6 billion active users may sound attractive, but as every banker and monetary policy maker knows, payment systems require a level of liquidity backstopping that no private entity can provide. Unlike states, private parties must operate within their means and cannot unilaterally impose financial obligations on others as needed. That means they cannot rescue themselves. They must be bailed out by states or be permitted to fail. The immense volatility in cryptocurrency prices makes them poorly suited to be either a medium of exchange or a unit of account, especially for the long term contracts that end up in the modern economy. A volatile asset can be used to buy a pizza, but is hardly useful when it comes to employment or supply chain contracts that firms sign over the years. Recent years have seen attention focused on stable coins such as Facebook's Libra, called Deem now. These are backed by either sovereign currencies such as dollar or physical assets such as gold or designated to be used for payments in the traditional financial system as well. Cryptocurrency prices have soared during a decade when much of the world was battling deflation rather than inflation. In case the recent deflationary momentum picks up, it will be worth seeing which way cryptocurrency prices move. But ultimately, they are not considered stable to be widely accepted as means of payments or investment at this point, especially considering how the trajectory of Bitcoin has been. General studies for public or civil service values and ethics in public administration, status and problems, ethical concerns and dilemmas in government and private institutions, laws, rules, regulations, and consigns as sources of ethical guidance, accountability and ethical governance, strengthening of ethical and moral values in governance, ethical issues in international relations and funding, corporate governance. The question here is, do you think the Weberian model of traditional bureaucracy in India is obsolete and beside the point in present day public services? In the classical approach to administration, Weberian model of bureaucracy finds a central place. Max Weber is the first thinker who has systematically studied the bureaucracy. He has provided a theoretical framework and basis for understanding bureaucracy. Max Weber's analysis influenced many modern writers on bureaucracy. The Weberian ideal type bureaucracy continues to be the dominant paradigm in the public administration. Weber gave features of ideal type bureaucracy. The features of the ideal type of bureaucracy as organization are as follows. Administration is carried out on a continuous basis, not simply at the pleasure of the leader. Tasks in the bureaucratic organization are divided into functionally distinct areas, which each with the requisite authority and sanction. Officers are arranged in the form of a hierarchy. The resources of the bureaucratic organization are distinct from those of members as private individuals. That is, administrators do not own the means of administration. The office holder cannot appropriate the office. That is, the office cannot be sold by the official or passed on by heredity. Administration is based on written documents. Control in the bureaucratic organization is based on impersonally applied rational rules. Thus, it is not simply the existence of rules, but the quality and mode of application of those rules that distinguishes the bureaucratic organization. Relevance in contemporary times. In spite of criticism from the several scholars, the ideas of Weber on bureaucracy continue to be relevant to understand the present administrative system. So far, we have not been able to evolve an alternative model to Weber's bureaucracy. Weber is right in saying that when we are accustomed to the bureaucracy, we cannot think of any other alternative. It is highly useful for managing large scale organizations. His ideas on selection of officials based on qualifications, utility of written documents in administration, hierarchy, etc., can be seen in any administration of the present day. The monocratic bureaucracy proposed by Weber is superior to all other forms of organizations in achieving the prescribed objectives. To overcome some of the problems of the bureaucracy, we can only bring reforms in it, but cannot replace it with other organizations. Whether it is a capitalist society or a socialist society, irrespective of the nature of economy, we find the bureaucracy playing a very important role. People who talk about the debureaucratization of the society have not been able to find a viable alternative to the bureaucracy. Even in the present context of liberalization and privatization, which emphasizes on a minimal state, cannot escape the necessity of bureaucracy to perform some of the functions of the state. We cannot think of the implementation of all the welfare and developmental programs without the help of bureaucracy. The voluntary organization and other forms of people's organization can only supplement the bureaucracy, but they cannot substitute the bureaucracy. In the context of developing countries, people look to bureaucracy for their day to day requirements. Hence, the bureaucracy of Weberian type continues to find its relevance even today. Weber can be considered as one of the eminent thinkers of 20th century. Though he has written extensively on various subjects, his contribution to the theory of bureaucracy is highly valued. Today, we can see it in practice in all the societies of the world. Weber being proved correct when he said that the societies once governed by the bureaucracies can never get rid of it. His ideas on authority, rationality of bureaucracy continues to be relevant for the present day society. Most of the time, those who criticize the Weberian model are not actually criticizing Weber, but the present day bureaucracy, which reflect the changes that are taking place in the contemporary period. Bureaucracy might need certain reforms to make it more relevant to the society.